Have you ever stopped to think how amazing memory is? Like, you can remember your 10th birthday party, maybe, but not where you just put your keys.
Right. It's fascinating how we grab information, keep it, pull it back out. It's a huge puzzle psychologists have been working on for ages.
And they've come up with these frameworks, these models to try and map it out. Maps that change as we learn more, of course.
Exactly. And today we're diving deep into one of the real foundational maps, the multi-store model of memory, MSM Atkinson and Shiffrin back in '68.
That's the one. So our mission for this deep dive, get a really solid handle on this model. What are its parts? What was the evidence? And, what came later, the criticisms and refinements.
Yeah, without getting lost in the weeds, just the core ideas, how they thought about memory back then. It really shaped everything that followed.
We'll take it step by step. Look for those aha moments, maybe some surprising bits too. So let's start with the basic layout, the structure of the MSM.
Okay, so picture the 1960s. Computers are becoming a thing. And the MSM took inspiration from that, thinking of us, humans, as information processors.
Like a biological computer.
Kind of, yeah. And this led them to propose three distinct memory stores, separate boxes almost.
Right, you got sensory memory, then short-term memory, STM, and finally long-term memory, LTM.
And the key idea was sequence. Information flows through them, hits the senses first.
Then, if you pay attention.
Attention is crucial. Then it gets into short-term memory, and from there, potentially into long-term memory.
So STM is like the gatekeeper for LTM in this view.
Pretty much, yeah. And that initial step, paying attention, without it, the information just fades, doesn't even make it into STM.
Okay, let's zoom in on that very first stop then, sensory memory.
Think of it as like an immediate, super brief copy of what your senses are picking up.
Like an echo or a quick visual flash.
Exactly. The model talks about iconic memory for vision, that image that lingers for a split second. And echoic memory for sound hearing the last word someone said hang in the air for a moment.
Like when you look away from a bright light and still kind of see it.
That's iconic memory, yeah. And the key thing is how incredibly short-lived it is.
How short are we talking?
Fractions of a second for iconic. Maybe a few seconds, 2 or 3, for echoic. Really brief.
Wow. So most of what hits our senses just vanishes instantly.
That's the idea. Only the tiny fraction we actually attend to gets passed along to the next stage, to short-term memory.
Okay, so the stuff we focus on lands in STM. Now, the classic idea here, the one everyone learns first, is about its capacity, right? It's pretty small.
Very limited, yeah. The famous number is 7 plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9 items.
That comes from George Miller's paper in '56, The Magic Number 7.
That's the one. He looked at how many digits or letters people could hold in mind, and it seemed to hover around 7.
And it doesn't stick around for long either, unless you do something.
Duration is also limited. Maybe 6 to 18 seconds, typically.
Nice. You rehearse it, keep repeating it.
Exactly. Rehearsal is vital in the MSM. It keeps the information active in STM, but it's also the mechanism that supposedly transfers it to long-term memory.
Like juggling balls, you have to keep tossing them to keep them in the air and maybe eventually put one in a box.
Good analogy. And because that STM space is so limited, new stuff coming in can easily knock out what's already there.
Ah, okay. Like trying to remember a phone number and someone asks you a question and poof, the number's gone.
Precisely. Displacement.
But you mentioned Miller's Magic Number 7. That idea's been challenged, hasn't it? It feels so neat. 7 plus or minus 2.
It does, but yeah, later research started to question it. People like Nelson Cowan, for instance, back in 2010.
What did he find?
Well, he argued Miller's tasks might have let people use strategies, like chunking information together, which inflated the number. Cowan used different methods, like a running span procedure where you don't know how long the list will be.
Okay.
And his results suggested the true capacity for brand new, unrelated items might be smaller, maybe more like 3 to 5 items.
Wow, that's quite a difference. From potentially 9 down to maybe just 3 or 4.
Yeah. It suggests our pure, focused attention capacity is really quite tight.
Is there any, brain evidence for that smaller number?
There is, actually. Some fMRI studies, Vogel and Machizawa did one in 2004, looked at brain activity, specifically in the parietal cortex, which is key for this kind of working memory. And they found activity increased as people held more items, but it tended to plateau, to level off, around 3 or 4 items.
Huh. As if the brain's resources for just holding those items kind of max out there.
Sort of, yeah. It lends biological support to Cowan's idea of a smaller core capacity.
It also makes you think about ecological validity, doesn't it? Like, how often are we really just memorizing random lists of digits in everyday life? Maybe those original lab tasks weren't quite capturing real-world memory use.
That's a really important point. The context matters. So, okay, we have fleeting sensory memory, limited short-term memory. What about the stuff that actually makes it through? That gets us to LTM.
Long-term memory, the big one, the brain's archive.
Exactly. And according to the MSM, this store has potentially unlimited capacity. You can keep adding to it.
And things can stay there indefinitely, like forever.
Potentially, yes. Though getting them back out, retrieval, that's another story. But the storage itself is seen as vast and durable.
But it's not like a perfect video recording, right? You said it's stored differently.
Right. The model, and later ideas too, suggest it's stored more semantically, based on meaning. Like an outline, not a perfect transcript.
So when we remember something, we might be reconstructing it a bit.
Very much so. We retrieve the gist, the key points, and our brain might fill in gaps based on our general knowledge or expectations. This connects to ideas like schema theory, which we might touch on.
Okay, that makes sense. Like remembering the idea of a holiday rather than every single second.
Exactly. And within this huge LTM store, researchers realized there are different types of memories.
Ah, yes, the difference between knowing what happened and knowing how to do something.
Precisely. That's the big split. Declarative memory, knowing what, and procedural memory, knowing how.
Declarative is the stuff you can consciously recall and talk about.
Yep. And that splits further into two types. There's episodic memory, your personal experiences, events tied to a time and place, like remembering what you had for breakfast this morning or that birthday party.
Your own life story, basically.
Right. And then there's semantic memory. This is your general knowledge,
Yeah.
facts, concepts, meanings, knowing Paris is in France, knowing what a dog is. It's not tied to when or where you learned it.
Just general facts about the world.
Exactly. And then the other main branch is procedural memory.
The knowing how skill.
Yes. Riding a bike, tying your shoes, playing piano. These are things you often do without conscious thought about the steps. Your body just knows. It's often unconscious memory.
Okay, so the model proposes these distinct stores, distinct types of memory. What was the evidence that really made people buy into this structure initially?
Well, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence came from case studies of people with brain damage. The most famous is probably HEM.
HM, right. Henry Molaison. He had surgery for epilepsy that removed parts of his brain, including the hippocampus.
And the tragic consequence was severe anterograde amnesia. He couldn't form new, long-term declarative memories, new facts, new events.
So he couldn't remember what happened yesterday or learn new names?
Exactly. But, and this is crucial, his short-term memory was largely intact. He could hold a conversation, remember things for a few seconds, or as long as he was actively rehearsing, and he could still access his old memories from before the surgery.
Wow. So that disconnect, okay, STM, okay, old LTM, but no new LTM, that really looked like strong evidence for separate stores.
It really did. It suggested STM and LTM relied on different brain structures. Although, interestingly, HM could form new procedural memories, like learning new motor skills, even though he had no conscious memory of ever doing the task before. That added complexity later, but initially, the declarative memory deficit was key evidence.
It really makes you think about what memory is, doesn't it? If you can't form new memories of your life.
It profoundly impacts identity, absolutely.
Okay, so HM was huge. Was there experimental evidence too?
Yes. Another classic study is Glancer and Kunitz from 1966. They looked at free recall remembering words from a list in any order.
What did they do?
They gave people lists of, say, 15 words. One group recalled them immediately. Other groups had a delay before recall 10 seconds or 30 seconds. And during the delay, they did a distractor task, like counting backwards.
So event rehearsal.
Exactly, to clear out short-term memory.
And what happened?
With immediate recall, people remember the first few words. Well, that's the primacy effect, and also the last few words. Well, the recency effect, the U-shaped curve.
Okay.
But when they added the delay with the distractor task, the recency effect largely disappeared. People didn't remember those last few words well anymore. The primacy effect, however, remained strong.
Ah, so the interpretation was,
The primacy effect happens because those first words get rehearsed more, making it into LTM. The recency effect happens because the last words are still sitting in STM at the moment of recall.
but the distractor task wiped out the STM contents, eliminating the recency effect, while the LTM traces for the early words survived.
Precisely. It looked like clear evidence for two distinct stores with different characteristics. STM being fragile and needing rehearsal, LTM being more robust.
So with evidence like HM and the primacy recency studies, the MSM seemed like a really solid model for its time.
It absolutely was. Groundbreaking.
Hmm.
But like all scientific models, it wasn't the final word. It's now generally seen as, well, a bit too simple.
Oversimplified. In what ways?
Well, a major one is that it treats the stores as quite separate units. We now know there's much more interaction, especially between STM and LTM.
Okay. What else? Does it explain everything we experience with memory?
Not really. It doesn't easily explain memory distortion, for example. Why our memories aren't always accurate, why they can change. The model implies more passive storage.
Right, the reconstructive nature we talked about.
Exactly. And it also struggles with things like flashbulb memories, those vivid memories for shocking events that seem to form instantly, without much rehearsal.
Or, conversely, why sometimes you rehearse something like mad studying for a test and it just doesn't seem to transfer properly to LTM.
Right. The model suggests rehearsal is the key, but clearly the type of rehearsal or how meaningful the information is must play a role, which the basic MSM doesn't fully capture.
So the idea of STM just being a passive gateway was maybe too limited.
That's what later researchers argued. Alan Logie, for instance, in '99, suggested STM isn't just a passive waiting room. He called it more like a workstation.
A workstation? What does that mean?
It means it's an active space where we manipulate information, work with it, and crucially, where information from LTM is brought in to help us process new information coming from our senses.
Ah, so STM and LTM are constantly interacting in this view. STM isn't just passing things to LTM, it's also using stuff from LTM.
Exactly. You use your existing knowledge from LTM to interpret and make sense of what you're currently thinking about in the STM workstation. This links much better to concepts like working memory and schema theory.
That sounds much more dynamic and frankly more like how thinking actually feels.
It does. So the MSM, while foundational, has definitely been built upon and refined. It was a vital first step, but memory turned out to be even more complex and interconnected.
Absolutely. It really highlights that scientific process, doesn't it? Start with a model, test it, find its limits, and then build something more nuanced.
Precisely. The MSM gave us the basic language, encoding, storage, retrieval, the idea of different stages, but the picture is much richer now.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've journeyed through the multi-store model, the 3 boxes: sensory, short-term, long-term.
We talked about the limited capacity and duration of STM, the classic magic number 7, and how later work, like Callan's, suggested maybe a smaller core capacity, around 3 to 5 items.
We looked at key evidence, like the tragic case of HM showing distinct STM and LTM, and the Glanzer and Kunitz study demonstrating primacy and recency effects.
And we also covered the limitations, how it oversimplifies things, doesn't fully explain memory reconstruction, or why rehearsal isn't always effective, leading to ideas like Logie's STM workstation.
But we have to remember its historical importance, right? It really kicked off a whole era of memory research.
Absolutely critical. It provided that essential framework to build upon, question, and refine.
So a final thought for you listening. Think about your own memory. Those times are really old memory, just surfaces, crystal clear, maybe triggered by a smell or a song, even though you haven't consciously rehearsed it.
Or the opposite, struggling to recall something you know you learned, something you repeated over and over.
Yeah.
How do those very real experiences fit or maybe challenge that simple sequential flow of the original MSM?
Yeah, and if short-term memory is more like an active workstation, constantly dipping into your long-term knowledge base, what does that imply about how we learn, how we connect new ideas to old ones, how we truly make memories that stick?
Definitely something to mull over. It suggests memory isn't just about storage bins, but about active construction and connection.